Welcome to Enlightened Omnivore, the monthly podcast that serves up a delicious mix of food, sustainability, and travel. I'm your host, Steve Sabaker, here to explore the wonders of mindful eating. Join me each month as I dig into the stories behind our food system, discover new ways to live sustainably, and embark on culinary adventures around the globe or right in your very own kitchen. Get ready to expand your palate and your mind, one bite at a time. This is Enlightened Omnivore, everything in moderation. I'm really pumped about today's guest because he's here to help demystify a topic that's always felt a bit like a riddle to me. Carbon credits, cap and trade, carbon tax. You might be wondering what these have to do with being an enlightened omnivore, but hang in there with me. This could actually be the key to making eco-friendly food choices and many other sustainable choices more economically viable. Let me back up a bit. Some of you might cringe and others may cheer when I say that back in the day, I was pretty convinced the free market could solve just about anything, including climate change. Now that I've got a few more years under my belt, I see the importance of government spending for things like public education, the military, healthcare. But as a serial entrepreneur and a recovering small business owner, I also get that the market plays a huge role in shaping our everyday decisions. Private sector economics will be a huge factor in how we tackle environmental issues in the coming decades. So I reached out to my next guest, Nathan Truitt, and asked him to help translate what the carbon market really is, and to share how some of these economic tools and solutions are being used to push us toward carbon neutrality. Nate's got a pretty impressive background. He's the Executive Vice President of Climate Funding at the American Forest Foundation and runs the Family Forest Carbon Program. I'm even more fascinated by his early career in the Peace Corps in Turkmenistan. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk more about that. He spent some time pondering international education and development in places like Uzbekistan, Serbia, and Kosovo. And for the past decade, he's been all about designing and scaling big picture environmental solutions using America's forests as the model. I'm also excited to talk to Nate a little bit about this concept of pragmatic or practical environmentalism. It's this idea that, if we work together with all the stakeholders, even the folks we don't like, or maybe the folks on the other side of the aisle, we can come up with solutions that gives everybody what they need, but not necessarily what they want. And I think this is so crucial in this time when there's all kinds of conflict, all kinds of polarization, a lot of shouting and not a lot of listening. How do you get folks with incentives and motivations and ideologies that seem incredibly in opposition to the table and to talking to each other? And I think Nate's got a couple of examples of that. No pressure, Nate. But anyway, we actually go way back, Nate and I. We both were getting our undergraduate degree at Pomona College when we met as aspiring ancient historians. So we really put that liberal arts education to work, choosing fields completely different from our degrees. Anyway, let's get started. Nate, thanks so much for joining Enlightened Omnivore today.
Wow. First of all, thanks very much for having me. Super excited to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for being here. Okay, can you share a little bit about your journey? I mean, we talked a little bit in your bio about a lot of the things that you've done in your life, and you've had a long career in conservation and environmentalism. And you and I spoke a few weeks ago about that transformation you went through, when you were going from an environmental advocate to then an environmental professional. So what led you to the field and now your role at the American Forest Foundation?
It's a great question. So after graduating from college, from Pomona, go Sage Hens,
Yeah.
I went to the Peace Corps in Turkmenistan. And I didn't really have a good reason for doing that. Even in retrospect, I haven't been able to invent a convincing story about that makes any kind of sense. over there, I basically got involved in what I would call community and international development. And then I met my wife over there. We had a growing family. And at a certain point, we want to come back to the United States. I always joke it's so that my daughter, who was born in the US, could be eligible to be president one day. And in all honesty, that is something I sometimes dream about. When I did that, it became harder and harder to work in international development if you're sort of unwilling to live abroad and travel abroad. So I began looking, where could I use the same skill set, which is sort of program design, but in a domestic context. And through that, I got into fundraising, philanthropic fundraising for environmental issues. Growing up, my family was heavily involved in Outward Bound and outdoor education. And so, I grew up reading Edward Abbey and sort of more of the hard left edge of the environmental movements. And I was quite uncompromising in my belief that there's sort of a right way and a wrong way to treat nature and natural resources. And so I thought, that's what the environmental movement is for. I'll go work for those people and it will be very rewarding. And it was, but once you got into, I like the way you put it, from being an advocate to a professional, right? So you're in those organizations, you're seeing how they make decisions, you're interacting with stakeholders, government, business, so on and so forth, and seeing how they make decisions. And it just quickly becomes a far more complicated picture than you realized. And you sort of along the way come to realize that true positive environmental outcomes are not about one side sort of forcing the other side to comply with a certain set of rules or regulations. It's really more about designing systems in which all of the various stakeholder groups can kind of get what they need out of the system, because not everyone shares the same values, right? So you might be able to win an election, pass a law, but if you're doing it over and into the teeth of economic objections or food security issues or anything like that, it's not going to persist, right? It's going to be temporary. And once you sort of understand that, then everything switches. It's no longer just about raising money to go fight the bastards, right? Or it's about, how do we actually get everyone involved? Everyone is giving something, everyone is getting something. And that's a much more interesting place, even if it is a little bit less, romantic a view of environmental conservation. So that's where I am now at the American Forest Foundation.
And we're going to talk a little bit more about what you're currently doing and the work you're doing in the carbon markets with trees and lumber and private forests. But before we go into that, can you explain the real basic premise of the carbon markets and how they're supposed to reduce global emissions?
Yes, absolutely. So at its most basic, the idea of a carbon market is that you're going to have some options to mitigate carbon dioxide emissions or other greenhouse gas emissions that are really, really, really expensive, right? And they're expensive because maybe we don't have the technology yet to determine it. Maybe we don't have the accounting frameworks or systems to discover it. Maybe the system in which we're operating is sort of not ready for that particular innovation. The idea of a carbon market is that you can take funds and devote them towards decarbonization in other sectors, right? You could go find other places where the costs of reducing emissions are lower, and you can devote your finance there. And on a global level, that will lead to atmospheric reductions in carbon dioxide, even though it might not lead to reductions within your own company's footprint. And a great example of this is jet fuel, right? So, people are not going to stop flying. There's not a great ready-made solution to produce diesel fuel of the quality needed to fly airplanes from renewable sources, right? So for the foreseeable future, that's going to be mainly based on fossil fuels. Okay. So then if you're an aviation company, should you therefore just do nothing about climate change? You're just like, well, there's nothing that we can do.
So then basically the airline can buy carbon credits from a company or industry that is carbon sequestering, not carbon producing, like let's say a lumber forest, and then incorporate the cost into its bottom line so that it's basically accounting for the carbon it's using.
So that's the basic idea of a carbon market, is that it's going to drive finance to the most cost-effective places to generate either emissions reductions or removals of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That's the theory, at least. I think we'll get into, like, in some cases is working, in other cases is really not, and what are the overall challenge. The other thing I just quickly say is people who are uncomfortable with carbon markets, or the idea that we should in any way be sort of like commodifying nature or our responses to this really important challenge of climate change, will often say something like, well, carbon markets alone won't solve climate change. And I just want to say right off the top, that is absolutely correct. And no one believes that carbon markets are the only thing we should be doing. They are one of many tools that we're going to need to respond to climate change. But they're a very powerful tool for a certain set of hard to abate sectors.
And I appreciate that clarification for sure. Like, what kind of company wants to do this? You mentioned the airline industry. Is it because they're getting pressure from their customers, because they're getting regulatory pressure? Like, why does a company choose to engage in the carbon market?
Yeah, it's a great question. And here we should distinguish that there's actually multiple carbon markets to make this even more confusing. There are what we would call compliance markets, where basically a government has said, okay, you as a business must do these certain things. And one of the things you can do, one of your options, is to engage in a carbon market, right? So there the pressure is coming from a regulator and a company saying, okay, I have to do this. And those exist in Europe, in California, and a couple other jurisdictions. But by and large, when we're talking about the global carbon market, we are mainly talking at this point about the voluntary market. Although hopefully that will change, and over time, most markets will be regulated to some degree. So let's talk about the voluntary market for a second. Why would a company engage in the voluntary market? There's a number of reasons. The traditional one is, well, it will help us tell a better story about our products, right? And when you think about the carbon market of 10 years ago, that's why people were doing it. They wanted to put a carbon neutral sticker on whatever they were selling that made you feel good about it and more likely to buy it. That is no longer the main reason why companies do this. And I think actually I could go farther and say there's general agreement that that's kind of actually an inappropriate use of carbon markets to make those kind of claims. Because any economic activity that you're doing in our current system, it is just not going to be carbon neutral. It's going to have some sort of climate effect. So today, companies think about it in a more sophisticated, I think more enduring way, as a way to respond to the concerns of their key stakeholders, those partners that they want long-term business relationships with. And all of those stakeholders are interested in a company's long-term viability. This is important. Like those stakeholders may or may not be, climate warriors and really aligned with environmental progress, but that's actually not the main reason they're asking these questions of companies. They're looking at a company and saying, okay, in the face of a rapidly warming climate and in the face of rising prices for emitting carbon dioxide, and that's already happening, right? In a global environment, even if you are headquartered in the United States where there isn't a price on carbon, you're doing business in California, in Europe, in other jurisdictions where there is a price on carbon, and that price is going to go up over time. So if you're a stakeholder, you're looking at that company and you're saying, you look to have a viable business now, but will you still have a viable business when the price of carbon is doubled or tripled or quadrupled? Prove to me that you will before I sign this contract with you, before I park my money with you, before I come to work for you. Because I don't want to be doing this if 3 years from now, when carbon prices rise, you're all of a sudden going to be out of business. And so companies then say, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to, first of all, come up with a plan to reduce our emissions over time. Then that's great. But we're going to go a step farther, and we're effectively just going to tax ourselves for the extent to which we're either emitting at all or we're behind on the plan. Different companies have sort of different approaches to this. And that will serve as a kind of assurance for you, our stakeholders, so that you can see we don't only have plans, but we're holding ourselves accountable to those plans. I want to be really clear. A lot of companies that engage in the carbon market would listen to what I just said and say, wait, no, that's not why we do it. But I think that is why they do it, even if they don't always realize that's why they do it. And this has more to do with the way companies make environmental decisions. They tend to be siloed. So you might have the C-suite, you have the CFO, you have the investor relations people. And then typically you've got a group of sustainability people who are kind of executing a sustainability strategy. And they might not always be connected to the way these decisions are being made. But that is our theory at AFF as to how a company can create actual competitive advantage through the appropriate use of a decarbonization strategy, first and foremost. That's most important. But then secondly, through the strategic and judicious use of high quality carbon credits.
So what is the difference between carbon credits and cap and trade?
Okay, great question. So a cap and trade system basically it's a regulated market where a government will sort of set a cap for emissions and will say there can be no emissions beyond this cap. And then individual companies under the cap they'll have a certain amount of emissions that they're sort of allowed. And then if they end up emitting more, they're going to have to go buy allowances, which they can buy from other companies. So maybe other companies will have been more successful at decarbonizing and they'll have an extra amount of emissions that they're allowed and they can sell it to the other company. Or some cap and trade systems will allow a company to buy carbon credits from sectors that are not covered by the cap. For example, most of the California cap and trade carbon credits come from forestry. And there's a certain percentage that you can buy. You can't, just to be clear, you can't buy all of your allowances from carbon credits.
And so the cap and trade system seems to be more a government run market where there's a limit on how much each company can emit, or the total ecosystem can emit, and then each company is a part of that.
Correct.
And then you can trade with companies that maybe are carbon, negative, that are actually sequestering carbon, like the forestry industry, or I've come across it in now the regenerative agriculture industry, where a lot of these grass finished beef ranchers are sequestering carbon with their soil management. And so this has been a big discussion amongst them as a way where they're creating another asset, basically, that people might want to buy in addition to this delicious beef. If the cap and trade is a government regulated market, where are we headed in terms of the industry of credit markets? Is mostly going to this volunteer market that you talked about, where people are kind of doing it for the benefit to the brand, or because the customer base is concerned about the impact that the product has on the environment? Or are we moving more to a cap and trade where government's really regulating and telling us, no, this is the max we can produce?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think you could talk to a lot of different people and they'll read the tea leaves differently. So just with the caveat, this is my own reading of the tea leaves. What you have now is you have a couple of highly regulated markets that are, some of them are cap and trade, some of them are carbon tax, right? Where there isn't a cap on the emissions, but every ton you emit, you have to essentially pay a tax for. And, there's all variety of mixes between those. Then you have sort of a global regulated market that is supposed to come into being, that comes from the Paris Climate Accords. And in particular, this is referred to as Article 6, which sort of sets up the framework for countries to trade back and forth their emissions. So, every country will set a goal, and then some countries may be behind, and some countries may be ahead, and they might trade themselves. So that could be one of the markets. And then you have this like voluntary market, which exists. And even the voluntary market, there's actually multiple voluntary markets and standards and so on and so forth. So the short way to say this is it's kind of a big mess for right now, right? I think where we're going to go is you're going to see governments begin to try and regulate the voluntary markets and incentivize companies to participate in it. So in other words, like let me just be really clear with everyone. There is zero chance of a national cap and trade system ever being passed in the United States, at least within the next decade. In my view, we're nowhere near the political will to do that. But what you might get is this is just an example, tax policy that sort of says, hey, if you're a company and you are doing A, B, C, and D, there's going to be some sort of favorable tax treatment for you, right? And what are A, B, C, and D? It's disclosing all of your emissions. It's publishing robust science-based targets. It's being transparent about where you are in the journey. And it's then purchasing carbon credits to compensate for where you're behind or to address any residual emissions. That is emissions that you literally can't reduce, right? So on and so forth. And then the government might even point to certain voluntary standards and say, these are the ones you should use when you're doing that. And so this sort of patchwork quilt will, we hope, emerge that does two main things. I mean, it's sometimes useful to think about what's the job of this. Number one, it's to increase the cost of emitting for companies. So like, however we can do that. In some places, it'll be hardcore regulation. In some places, it'll just be like pressure from people like us on the brands that we work with, right? Like every penny that we can increase that price will help against climate change. So that's job number one. And job number two is to take that tax, that penalty, that price that they're paying and channel it into the restoration of natural ecosystems, which for the foreseeable future will be our best bet in terms of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This is something that I think is often overlooked in the debate about climate. Everyone rightly focuses on we have to reduce our use of fossil fuels. This is absolutely true. That is job number one. But even if you did that at this point, in the most aggressive way possible, you take your most aggressive scenario and you execute it. And by the way, that's not happening right now, right? We're not on that path. But even if you did, we have too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as it is, right? So we have to figure out how to take that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And luckily for all of us, nature has engaged in a hundreds of millions of years long design and research and development process, and has bequeathed to us photosynthesis and trees, which are very effectively designed to do exactly this. So that's the other half, right? So increase the penalty that companies have to pay for emitting, and then channel that penalty into effective action to draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Those are like the two jobs that all of these carbon markets together have to do. And this is where I said before, like carbon markets aren't the only answer, but it's a powerful tool. It's hard to see any other tool that can really do particularly that second job as effectively as carbon markets, at least based on what's realistic right now.
So we're going to talk about forests and trees, because obviously that's your expertise, but it's also probably the most familiar means of sequestering carbon. I mentioned briefly there's ongoing research in the world of soil and its ability to sequester carbon, or grasslands, things like that. Are there other major natural processes that are major carbon sinks? You're not a biologist, but I'm just curious. What do we have at our disposal? What can Mother Nature do to put the genie back in the bottle?
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, everything we're going to talk about shares a common denominator, which is photosynthesis, right? Like one of my favorite quotations is, all true wealth creation is photosynthesis and everything else is just trading, right?
We're stealing.
Exactly. So, so yes, it's trees, but it is absolutely agricultural processes, soil carbon, the kind of crops you plant, how you manage them. Those all have a massive role to play. And then there's a lot of what's called blue carbon, right? So this could be everything from mangroves to seaweed to kelp, so on and so forth. But like, how do you basically create the conditions for the plants within the ocean, not necessarily the ocean itself, that's a separate climate solution, but the plants within the ocean to also be absorbing and sequestering more carbon dioxide. So those are what we would refer to as natural climate solutions, right? It's worth mentioning there's a lot of effort now to design technological solutions as well, like direct air capture, which use chemical processes to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And that's also going to be needed. It's just not ready to operate at any significant scale yet. So one way to think about the job that all of us have to do who work in the natural space, whether it's food or timber or whatever, like working lands that people are managing to produce the goods that we all depend on, is how do we just realign those systems so that they are optimized for carbon sequestration and storage alongside the production of those commodities. And we've got about 15 years to figure out the how, like what we want that to do, and then to basically make sure it's happening on every single acre of working lands across the globe. And that is an immensely difficult task. And we all need to get working on it like immediately.
So let's talk a little bit about that. Like, let's talk forest and lumber now. How does AFF work, and what are you guys doing to meet that 15-year timeline?
Yeah, so we, very briefly about the American Forest Foundation, we work with family-owned forests in the United States. And for those of your listeners who don't know, about 40% of our forests in this country are owned by individuals like you and me in relatively small sizes, 75 acres. By the way, for anyone listening who doesn't know what an acre is, and by the way, I encounter that all the time, and I think people feel like I should know what an acre is. An acre is about a football field. Not exactly, but that's kind of a good approximation. So, when I say a small parcel is 75 football fields, that will sound very big to people, but in terms of forest, that's actually quite small. So 40% of our nation's forests are owned by families and individuals. Collectively, they own land the size of Texas plus California combined. So it's a huge land area that they are managing. And the decisions that they collectively make on how to manage have huge repercussions for all of us and for the globe in terms of what sort of biodiversity they support, what kind of timber products they support, and that feeds into all kind of products that we use every day of our lives, and also carbon sequestration, carbon storage, also just air filtration, clean water. I mean, the list could go on and on. Forests provide a lot of ecosystem services. So our mission at AFF is to figure out, how do you get all those landowners the knowledge and the tools and the resources they need to manage their land so that it's maximizing all of those public goods that we all depend on? And for most of our history, we go back over 80 years in some form or fashion. Our theory has just been, it's all about education, right? You just like teach the landowners what they should do, and then your job is done. And it probably won't be surprising to anyone, but as we got more and more sophisticated in collecting data on our efforts, it turned out that education was not actually leading to a lot of behavior change.
Surprise, surprise.
And when we looked into that, we found, and this will surprise no one, it's because it is great that they now knew what they should be doing, but they lacked sort of the technical expertise to implement it. And it also cost something, right? So once we began to understand that, we understood we had to figure out a way to cover the costs of a transition to these more sustainable practices. And by the way, I should take a moment here to say, forestry in the United States in general is pretty good relative to sort of the global practice of forestry. We, even without any of the interventions I'm going to discuss, the United States grows more trees than it harvests, and it has done so for probably the last 100 years.
Is that right? 100 years?
Yeah. it's a success story in the environmental movement, the way that U.S. forests have been managed. And this is where we, sometimes in the environmental conversations, we get into like a black or white. Is it good? Is it bad? So it's pretty good. And there's still lots of room for improvement.
Sure. Well, let me ask this question. So,
Yep.
I mean, the United States, especially in the 1800s, went through this massive terraforming, negative terraforming, wiping out whole populations of animals, cutting down and kind of creating new ecosystems by settling the West. What changed? Because I think you would say, you probably wouldn't argue that Americans were cutting down more forests than they were planting in the 19th century.
Well, this is curious to me. I mean, the United States, especially in the 1800s, went through this massive terraforming, negative terraforming, right? Where whole populations of animals like the bison were wiped out, clear cutting of the forests for energy and making room for farmland, and settling the West. I mean, this changing the entire ecosystem and devastating it in many ways. What changed? Because I think you would probably say, or wouldn't argue, that America was cutting down more forests back in the 1800s than it was planting.
Right. Definitely not.
So what changed in the early 20th century where we started planting more trees than we were harvesting?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's really two things that happened. So the first is the agriculture in the Northeast became sort of not profitable to pursue at large scales. And so a lot of farmland throughout the Northeastern United States reverted just naturally to forest land. And in fact, anyone who spent any time in the forests of Vermont or New Hampshire knows exactly what I'm talking about. You can't walk more than 100 meters without coming across a stone wall that is a sign that there was agricultural activity, pasture land, something like that in the past.
Like in the middle of the forest, you'll just see walls everywhere, kind of artifacts of previous farms.
That's right. So the second thing that has happened is we have really improved our knowledge of the science of managing forests to be productive, right? Now, this can be controversial, right? When you are growing forests like they're corn, right? So you got them on a rotation and you're using fertilizer and there's a real science to it. Some people go, well, that's not really a forest, right? That's something else. I'm not here to tell anyone how they should think about that, but that has been extremely helpful in that the U.S. today produces way more timber and forest products than really it ever has. But it does so in a way more effective way that doesn't require us to, denude the forest landscape. Like we can do it within our existing forests. And a lot of that has to do with the implementation of silviculture, which is a series of scientific advancements that mainly came to our country from Europe, where they had much longer experience of sort of having to live within the boundaries of a constrained forest resource. So that came over to the United States in the early 20th century, and we've been implementing it and perfecting it.
And that's called silviculture?
Yeah, I mean, you could call it forestry, right? It's the practice of forestry, but silviculture is the science or the art of kind of managing individual trees or tree species to be productive.
Gotcha. So that's like when you go in Europe and you see all the trees like perfectly aligned, they're almost geometric plot lines. Those forests are under 200 years old, and some of them are under 50 years old. I mean, there's a real active management and clearing, cutting, and then replanting. So when you talk about the U.S. change, then we're growing more wood than we're cutting down. You mentioned that 75%, or no, the average acreage was 75 acres of forestry. That presumably was farmland originally and then reverted back to forests.
Gotcha. So that's like when you go to Europe and you see all the trees like perfectly aligned. They're almost geometric. along plot lines. Those forests are under 200 years old, and some of them probably under 50 years old, right? I mean, there's a real active management and a systematic clearing and cutting and then replanting of these forests. When you talk about the U.S. change, that we're growing more wood than we're cutting down, you mentioned that 75%, or the average acreage of a privately owned forest was 75 acres. Was that presumably farmland originally and has reverted back to forest?
Will depend on where in the country it is, but that's very common. So particularly in like the Northeast or the Mid-Atlantic, you will have forests that were cut down for agricultural purposes. And then at some point, they cease to be used for agriculture and they've sort of grown back. And that creates its own problems because those forests are what we might call even aged, meaning all the trees within that forest are kind of the same age, right? They all started growing at the same time. And that in itself is not quote unquote natural, right? For what a forest should do. So that's an example of how a landowner with that kind of forest might want to go in and selectively harvest some trees, right? Take out some, leave others, and might want to repeat that every 10 years over time. And, and that will accelerate that forest transition to a mature forest that resembles its sort of quote unquote natural ecological condition. So that's actually a great example of how you'd apply forestry and silviculture to accelerate the process of restoring the functionality of a forest ecosystem. To be clear, that will happen naturally over time. You leave that forest alone, some trees will get hit by lightning, some things will burn down, the others will get knocked down by wind. That same cycle will occur, but it might take hundreds of years, right? Where with active management intervention, we can do it in a shorter period of time.
How many of these private forests are actually being actively used for their resources? I mean, some of this presumably is fallow land or hard to access.
Yeah, so it's a really good question. It will again depend a little bit regionally and based on forest products markets, right? So for example, if you go to Colorado and you visit privately owned forests, it kind of doesn't matter what the landowner wants to do or believes about timber markets because there's just no mills to take the wood. So there's not much there. Similarly, if you go to Alabama, and anyone who's driven around the South, I mean, you cannot drive more than an hour without passing a logging truck, right? So the forest management is very, very active there. So there's a little bit of regional variation, but in general, those 40% of forests produce over half of the timber resources produced by the United States. So they are disproportionately actively managed compared to other forests, which again, I just want to remind everyone is not necessarily a bad thing, right? So it's not about management is bad. It's about what kind of management you're implementing. Used effectively, timber markets and timber harvesting can support the ecological outcomes that we want, particularly over the long term, right?
So let's talk about that. How do you guys work with privately owned forests to kind of actively manage the environment for the long-term benefit of the climate?
Okay, good. This is a great question. This is what AFF currently does, is we design effective, high integrity, high quality carbon projects. So what does that mean? Let's first of all describe what a low quality carbon project might look like. So Steve, let's assume that you own 100 acres in Pennsylvania of forest land. Okay. And I come and I say, wow, this is a beautiful forest you got here. You could theoretically cut it all down, right? So we're going to design a project. I'm going to pay you money not to cut down all of your trees. We're going to calculate how much carbon you not cutting down all of your trees represents. And any carbon project involves two scenarios. The project scenario, what actually happens, that's what we measure. And then the baseline, what we would call a counterfactual scenario, which measures what would have happened if you wouldn't have signed up for the carbon project. So in this case, we got a really lucrative carbon project, right? Because the baseline is you cutting down all of your trees. And the project scenario is you leave all your trees in place to grow. So we're going to make a lot of money right? We're going to issue a lot of carbon credits. What's the problem? The problem is if there was no carbon project, you probably would not have cut down all of your trees, right? That's not the kind of landowner you were. And that's also not the kind of forest products markets that are in the area of Pennsylvania. So that's an overly aggressive baseline. And for any of your listeners who've read about carbon markets, you've read a lot of exposés about junk credits or scam carbon markets. And that's effectively what's going on is there's a developer who is creating an unrealistic baseline, right? Okay. Now, does that mean we can't create carbon value from your forest? No, it does not. So let's talk about how we would create it. So you're a landowner. You're sitting there, you're like, I don't want to harvest my trees. I love my trees, right? I just want to leave them as they are, and that's it. Well, that's a great theory. That could be your intention. But one day you get into a car accident, right? And all of a sudden you've got to replace your Ford F-150 pickup truck. You just have to. And you're a working class person. You don't have a big bank account. You don't have a huge source of cash. So where can you get cash resources to replace your pickup truck? You could use your forest as a bank account. And so you're going to call up a logger and the logger is going to come and the logger is going to do what's probably best for the logger, which is to take out the biggest, most valuable trees that you have on your property. That's going to sound good to you too, right? Like now that I'm doing it, I might as well have the best timber sale possible. And so that logger will take out all of the best, the biggest, strongest trees and leave behind the smaller and weaker ones, right? And you'll get a big check. Everyone will be happy. What's the problem? Those biggest and strongest trees are biggest and strongest for a reason. They have the best genetics. They were out competing the other trees in that stand. And in most cases, they were still vigorous and healthy and growing, right? And so you've just taken out the engines of productivity of your forest, right? Those are the ones that were adding carbon sequestration, that were growing timber value the quickest. And so in the short term, you made a lot of money, but if we play that forward, you've just degraded the value of your land and your forest in a way that is ecologically harmful, but also financially harmful. This is the kind of miracle of forests is a lot of ecosystems require you to make trade-offs between like what's good economically and what's good environmentally. And in forests, in most cases, it's absolutely not the case. If we have the proper evaluation and the proper science, ecological and economic outcomes are very often aligned, particularly over the long term. Okay, so what do we do for a carbon project? We come to you and we say, Steve, good news. We're going to give you some money on a yearly basis. And the reason we're giving you that money is to help you make the transition to this longer term forest management. So you can still harvest trees if you must, right? That's totally up to you. But if you harvest the trees, you're going to do the opposite of what I just described. You're going to go in and harvest the small, junky trees, the ones that are competing for resources with those big, stronger ones. And in that way, we're actually simulating what natural processes will do over a much longer time frame. We're maintaining those engines of timber production and carbon sequestration and storage and, wildlife food provision and all those sorts of stuff on the landscape. They'll continue to grow. They'll become more and more valuable over time. And if you do that long enough, at a certain point, you can begin to harvest some of those trees. And they're so valuable that you can take, one or two here, one or two there, and it will still pay for itself. So it's much like in agriculture, the transition we're trying to make to organic agriculture, right? Like once you've made the transition, it's sort of self-reaffirming. You can make more money, but the transition itself is difficult. And that's the ideal role of a carbon project and climate finance. And then we can quantify that by just an appropriate baseline, not one where I pretend that absent this project, you would have cut down all your trees, but where instead I measure you compared to 10 of your neighbors that are in a very similar situation to you, right? So the same way we measure vaccines, for example, where, once I give you a vaccine in a trial, I can never know whether you would or would not have gotten the disease absent the vaccine. But I can establish a control group and track what happens to them who didn't get that vaccine. And in that way, I can infer that that project, that carbon payment made the difference and allowed you to accrue that improve carbon sequestration and storage. That gets turned into credit. That gets sold to companies, and the companies therefore pay for the entire operation. That's it in a nutshell.
So basically, you're trying to take the concept of a carbon market for the forestry industry, create a more realistic baseline for evaluating, the value of that carbon that it's sequestering, and then give the private forest owner better forest management tools that mimic the more natural process of a forest's life cycle?
Yes, that's, I'm going to listen to this podcast and write that down, and we're just going to start describing our work that way. That was a very succinct summary of what we're trying to do.
Well, I mean, I'm trying to follow along because this is fascinating to me to see that I feel like there's a movement in the environmental space where people are observing nature and nature's efficiencies and then celebrating those rather than challenging them or rather than optimizing a portion of that, where they're like, oh, here's how to grow trees faster, or, here's how to prevent forest fires. There's all these pieces, but as we know, this is an ecosystem that's really complicated. And we've only been actively observing for, arguably a few thousand years. But it seems like this method makes a lot of sense if it's mimicking Mother Nature's own survival instinct of how to maintain a healthy forest. What's the reaction from private forest owners?
I think private forest owners are generally very positive about the system. Oftentimes, their main objection is they will say, "Well, that's what I would have done anyway." Right. So, in one sense, that's true, right? In the same sense that January 1st, 2025, we all collectively will say, this year I'm going to go to the gym more, right? And it's true. We all will believe that we're going to go to the gym more, and some of us will go to the gym more, but others of us will not act on our intention. That's just some of us will need help, right? So if there was a program that incentivized us to go to the gym more, then you'd see more people act on their intention. So that's, I think, the main challenge with forest landowners is getting them to understand what the payment they're receiving is for. It's not to pay you to do something that you wouldn't do otherwise. It's to pay you to enable your intentions to become reality, right?
Right.
And then we do sometimes, climate change remains a little bit of a politically divisive issue that I think has decreased remarkably in the 5 years I've been working in this space. If for no other reason than if you live and work on the land, you know that climate change is real. Now, okay, our stance is you can then believe whatever you need to believe about why it's happening, and we don't need to talk about that, but we should all be agreed that we need to do something to restrain it, or we're going to lose these resources that we all value. But the core forestry that's what landowners want to do. So they need to understand how it works, what it means from a day-to-day or year-to-year perspective. And then they need financial help to implement it. Because like I said, sometimes, this is really easy if you're independently wealthy and you don't need your forest to produce any value for you. But that's not the majority of family landowners. They do need to generate some income from their land.
So how do you measure success in a program like this? I mean, is it kind of like penny wise, pound foolish, where these methods take a while to pay off? And so up front, it feels like, oh, wow, I'm not getting the kind of money I would get. What are those headwinds? And then how do you measure success?
Yeah. So I think the headwinds, first of all, is the carbon market, as we talked about earlier, is a little bit of a mess right now, right? So landowners hear all sorts of different things. There's all sorts of different projects out there. Some of them are good, some of them are not very good, and it's just confusing for landowners. So hopefully, as the market sort of comes together and there is more regulation, some of it governmental, some of it just self-regulation of the industry, that sort of complete Wild West aspect of it that exists now will go away, and it will become less confusing for landowners to participate. The second is exactly what you said, is that if you're producing anything via photosynthesis. By definition, it's going to take time. It doesn't happen overnight. And so that does require the buyers of carbon credits and the investors in carbon credit projects to have a kind of different view of these assets that they're investing in. This is not something for a VC to invest. Like, I have a lot of calls with VC funds that are interested, and I always tell them the same thing, which is I am constrained by photosynthesis, right? Like, there's only so much that I can do. I don't have an app that's going to disrupt photosynthesis, right? That's not a thing that happens in this world. And so there's not yet the investing framework globally to invest in nature. That's not only carbon, but that's all the different benefits and that natural capital provides. That's changing. There's a lot of work being done to sort of update those frameworks to make it more palatable and feasible to invest in nature. But right now, it's still very dependent on true believers or philanthropy or grants or all of that sort of stuff. And one of the big challenges for all of us, I think, and this certainly exists in the agricultural space too, is how do you mainstream this stuff? Once we mainstream it and we can really harness the power of capital markets, which, hey, love it or hate it, no one can argue that capitalism is extremely effective at generating very quick change on very large scales, right? So that's the goal, is like, how do you hack that system so that capital begins to work for the climate and for nature as opposed to against it? And that goes back to the very beginning of our conversation. That's the design conversation, which is messier and less emotionally rewarding than sort of standing on the corner and saying, we're right, you're wrong, you're the bastards trying to rape the environment, we're the purists trying to protect it. That's deeply satisfying emotionally, but it's not as effective in providing the kind of change we need at the scale and pace that we need it.
And I can totally appreciate that concept, because I know, there's a lot of emotion out there on this issue on both sides. But I've seen people on both sides of the issue also challenge this solution and there's some controversy behind it. And especially, you mentioned the Southeast, like, there's a lot of deforestation happening in the Southeast. Some of these organizations is being well managed. So when do carbon offsets, or when do these private forest carbon markets go off the rails? Like, how do we see things like that, where there's clear cutting in Alabama, let's say, of a forest that was actually part of a program for private forest owners?
And I can totally appreciate that concept, because I know there's a lot of emotion out there on this issue on both sides. But I've seen people challenge this solution you're recommending in terms of forestry management, and that there's some controversy around it. Especially, you mentioned the Southeast. Like, there's a lot of deforestation happening in the Southeast that some of these organizations say is perfectly responsible management of forests. And people are challenging that, right? So when do these private forest carbon markets go off the rails? Like, how is clear cutting a forest in Alabama appropriate for carbon forestry management?
Well, so a couple things. So first of all, we need to distinguish between deforestation, in which a land goes out of forest uses, and clear cutting, right? So now, clear cutting, very dirty word. No one likes it. It is actually the ecologically appropriate thing to do in some forest types, right? So there are some types of forests that are comprised of sort of monocultures of species, mainly in pine trees, that are used to, like, in their natural state, they regenerate through large scale replacement events. So think like a fire, right? Comes there, burns in all the trees, then a new group grows up. So clear cutting, I think, gets somewhat of a bad rap sometimes. Now, I want to be really clear. There are forests where you absolutely should not clear cut, and where it is a horrible idea, and so on and so forth. But a clear cut does not typically equal deforestation, right? Usually people are clear cutting and they're replanting behind it. Deforestation is not driven by the use of forest products, right? It's driven by the transfer of land to other uses. So, and in the Southeast, the main reason is the expansion of cities. So it's housing and commercial development. Okay, now with that set aside, there are forest carbon projects that go wrong. We've already talked about they set inappropriate baselines, right? That results in over crediting. That doesn't mean that the project isn't effective. It just means that the project isn't as effective as it's reported to be. This is the case with most tropical anti-deforestation projects, right? And I wish the media had some nuance about this, right? Again, it's black and white. It's either junk or it's good, right? The truth is they're not working as promised, but they're also not useless. Like, they are having an impact, and avoiding tropical deforestation is something that must occur for us to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. If we lose tropical rainforest, there is 0% chance of avoiding the worst effects of climate change. So that's one, baselining. The other is when we kind of take a simplistic view of forest carbon. Let me give you an example. A simplistic view would be for me to go to a landowner and be like, okay, I want you to sign a 100-year contract. You're just not going to cut any trees. Now, on the one hand, you could see how that would be a good carbon project, right? Like those trees will keep growing. They'll keep accumulating carbon. We all sort of celebrate. But the problem is that there's still a demand for timber products, right? People aren't going to magically stop using toilet paper. At least I don't think so anytime soon, or building with wood, or all the different ways that we use wood. And by the way, wood is a far more climate friendly material than the things that would replace it, like plastics or steel or concrete, right? So from a climate perspective, we actually want more wood use to happen. Okay. So if I stop you from harvesting, but that's all that I do, there won't be a climate benefit because the local mill will just find someone else to cut down the trees, right? I mean, there might be some climate benefit. The technical term for this in carbon markets is leakage. So that's an example of how you could have carbon projects kind of on paper producing a lot of benefit. But we always go back to ask the question, what difference does the atmosphere feel? And in that event, the atmosphere might not have felt any different. That's why you need carbon projects that don't seek to like end timber harvesting, but seek to reorient it over a longer time frame so that it aligns with the goal of carbon sequestration and storage. And the good news is, again, forests can do both. You can produce really high quality, durable timber products that are going to be harvested and used in long-lived applications. So in other words, that carbon will continue to be stored in buildings long after the tree is harvested. But to do it, you have to have the right forestry and the right silviculture. So that is the nuance of all of these markets, is like, how do we allow the conversation to get that one level down into the weeds, where we're ceasing to sort of like yell at each other, and instead we're having really informed design conversations. This is what we want. This is what we want. Okay, what trade-offs are we going to make? How do these things synergize? And I think, Steve, it's probably very similar to the conversations that happen in agriculture and in the beef industry.
Absolutely. And it's such an emotional issue. And people are so afraid that when you see things like, wait a minute, you're telling me that forest that's been completely cut down is better than having left. That's a hard argument for anyone to appreciate. But to your point, if those, lumber, which was, let's say, an invasive species or a monoculture and would not be as resilient to fire or wind or frost, could go into houses rather than concrete production. And then you can replant that forest, with a more sustainable baseline so that over the long term, it then grows back. I think I understand your point. We see that all the time when you're changing monoculture to these more, multi-product, multi-plant agricultural systems. At first it looks really catastrophic, or, you're plowing under perfectly good arable land and then leaving it fallow for a little while for a cover crop or something like that. And people get confused. But to your point, we need to think about the long-term systems and how they work more effectively. If you could give one piece of advice to someone looking to enter the environmental space and make a positive impact, what would it be after all these years?
Ooh.
Absolutely. And it's such an emotional response. You know, people are so afraid when they see something like, wait a minute, you're telling me that that forest that's been completely cut down is better for the environment than having left it alone? Like, that's a hard argument for anyone to appreciate. But to your point, if that lumber was an invasive species or a monoculture that would not create a healthy forest and not be resilient to fire or wind or frost, could then be used to build buildings rather than, super energy intensive concrete or steel, then that is a good thing. That adds value to the system, and you can simply then replant the forest with a more responsible program that will make it more resilient over hundreds of years. So I think I understand your point, and we certainly see that in agriculture. I mean, it's so much easier to grow corn and get the subsidies rather than go the organic route or turn that land into pasture land and grow grass-finished beef that's sequestering carbon or pasture-raised chickens that are building soil. Like, these are all viable business models, but the transition step is difficult. And it's also really jarring to people when they think, oh, well, beef is bad for the environment, or we've been farming corn for 100 years here, so how can that now be bad? And so they react to these situations in an emotional way rather than looking at the data or the research and how these practices have changed and evolved over time to become so reliant on chemical fertilizers and environmentally irresponsible methods that are using more carbon than they're sequestering. To your point, we need to think about the long-term systems and how they work more effectively. So if you could give one piece of advice to someone looking to enter the environmental space and how they could make a positive impact, what would it be after all these years?
What a good question. I'll sort of take it back to my Pomona days. The classes that I rolled my eyes through and slept through and told myself were beneath me and useless were all of the quote unquote useful sciences, economics, statistics, political science, all that sort of stuff. That was all dirty bargaining with the real world that I wasn't interested in. I was interested in truth and ideals, Steve, right? That's where things were.
I don't know, Plato's Crito and ancient history?
Exactly. Well, if only I could understand the secrets of the Greeks, everything would become, revealed. And I have come to realize that the first thing, if you want to be useful to environmental causes, the first thing you need to do is take a real hard look at the reality of the world and understand that the vast majority of people living on this planet do not share those set of values. That's not to say they don't value the environment, but they value other things equally or even higher. And frankly, having my own kids has really helped me understand that. Where once you have that, then you realize, okay, I'm going to do anything just to secure health, security, prosperity for them. So, and once you realize that reality, then you can begin to be an effective environmental advocate. You've got to take that into account. And you have to resist the urge to engage in magical thinking that, oh, well, one day people will have a revolution in consciousness and everyone will just understand this is the way it should be. And overnight, these things will change. That's just not the way the world works, even though maybe that's the way the world should work. I also don't want to say that that's naive or impossible. I get it. I used to think that way too. But at a certain point, you have to make a decision between, am I going to be effective at making change, which means working within the world as it is, or am I going to continue to work on the premise of a world that unfortunately is probably just not going to come into being? So that would be my slightly depressing advice. And in full transparency, I'll tell your listeners what I told you in our prep call, which is if the 22-year-old version of myself could see what I do today, they would probably kick my ass. So there may be a little bit of rationalization in that answer. But
well, Nate, I want to give you a big hug, not kick your ass, because I think you're absolutely right. I mean, this is the biggest issue that we're dealing with, for sure. But ultimately, we need to still be on the planet to appreciate whatever we put into place. And so we need to maintain human survival at a level of quality of life that people are accustomed to. And I think with your earlier point, coming up with systems and programs that both mimic what Mother Nature's already doing, and then keep in mind the folks who have prioritized other critically important priorities of life over climate change because they have no choice. We've got to keep everyone in mind, even those folks who aren't prioritizing climate change. I mean, that's my 2 cents, whatever it's worth. But I really appreciate you taking the time today to talk with us and teaching me about this very important part of the environmental discussion. I mean, we think so much about agriculture on this show, and I think we talk a lot about transportation and building as, major carbon costs. But what about these forests, which are a passive system and maybe the best solution for us getting out of this problem in the first place? So thanks for sharing it with us, and I really hope that you come back sometime soon to Enlightened Omnivore.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. This has been an absolute joy, and I really appreciate it.
Nate, have a beautiful day. And that wraps up another episode of Enlightened Omnivore. A special thanks to all my subscribers for listening in this week. You can all read more about everything omnivorous on my weekly Substack newsletter found at enlightenedomnivore.substack.com. Join me next month as we continue to uncover the stories behind our food and the new ways we can live sustainably together. Thank you for tuning in. This is Steve Sabaker reminding you to savor every bite and eat mindfully. Until next time, keep it balanced and stay enlightened. This is Enlightened Omnivore, everything in moderation.